Dr. Roy Balleste, thank you for coming on the show. It's
My pleasure.
pleasure's all mine. So let's get going. What is space law?
Space law is an old area of the law that has become more prominent in this day and age. But it goes back to 1967 and actually even back to the beginning of human beings entering outer space. So it became a question that needed to be addressed when the Russians sent their first satellite into space, Sputnik, uh, following by the second satellite from the United States. Humanity needed to decide what to do, what we could put out there, how we were going to use space, the rules of engagement, some ethical considerations, and planning for the future. But that that is in general. But space law is mainly based on five treaties, four of which are still pretty much in force, and one that has become more of a guiding principle.
And how does that tie it for people who don't know much about law or just getting into it? It falls under international law. How does that work and how do those two kind of tie together?
So international law is a law of nations. So I'm not talking now about public international law. That's even much older. But all the nations in the world follow the same standard. And that standard was reinforced with the creation of the United Nations and the Charter of the United Nations in 1948 after World War II. In essence, to try to avoid a major world conflict like that one. And so the Charter, in essence, is a guiding document on how nations behave with one another. Out of that framework, uh, the treaties of space law came about. So we have trade law, customary law, which is also how nations deal with one another, but without a treaty. So what happens when we don't have a treaty? So the customs and the traditions of how nations are expected to behave and normally behave is usually there is a little bit of common sense attached to that. You're not expected to shoot down planes, torpedo uh, boats for during commercial activities and things like that. Uh, so out of that, space law has benefited for many years because we have uh, documents that governments have agreed on and they have signed on to them. All governments of those nations have agreed that particular standards and procedures need to be followed in outer space. So for that, we have the Outer Space Treaty. That's the general framework. And more specifically, if something goes wrong, we have the Liability Convention. If there is a problem with astronauts or their equipment, we look at the Rescue Agreement. We also have the Registration Convention, which handles, in essence, handles the launching of these activities, and we keep track of where they are to avoid collisions, and if there were collisions, what to do about it. And finally, the Moon Agreement, which is the one that it will need a revision uh, now that we are China, Russia, and the US are planning to send astronauts.
So we have kind of two areas of where space law can come in through the customary law where things just happen and just because there's not a treaty if two countries are acting in a certain way that can become binding, but then there's the actual treaties where it's like it's written law, we know what it is, it's
That's
there.
right.
How does the so what are the Artemis Accords? That's been in the news a lot lately. More people are signing on to that. Is that going to become one of the big treaties? I know it's originally authored by the U.S. Just how is that working? How's that playing out today?
Yeah, the Artemis agreement is more of a practice of the U.S. In order to enter into agreements with the nations. So the age of the big multilateral treaties like the Outer Space Treaty uh, is at the moment is not the number one way of nations entering agreements with another. In part because the world is divided, ideology is dividing individuals, and national interest, national security. So what we have is bilateral agreements. The U.S. one on one, the U.S. with different nations. So the Artemis agreement are individual agreements that the U.S. enter with particular nations to cooperate in the next stage of uh, space exploration. And those will be the projects of Artemis 2 and 3. So Artemis 1, it was mainly the U.S. sending a capsule around the moon to test the capsule. They were full of stuffed animals and souvenirs and stuff like that just for fun. But they tested all the system, make sure that was okay. It was over a week, the loop around the moon. We're sending astronauts. Uh, I mean, right now, if something goes wrong in the International Space Station, they can go to escape pod and escape and return. But once you are on the moon, in the other side of the moon, you're on your own. So they have to be very careful. So Artemis 2 is going to send individuals around the moon. Artemis 3 is going to land them on the moon. And for that, we require the gateway, the very next space station. So the U.S. has, I believe, already, if not 30, around 30 countries that have signed on to cooperate in one way or another. Sending astronauts, eventually, imagine they all want to go to space. So initially, it's going to be sharing resources, sharing scientists, sharing data, and sharing financial cooperation. So the Artemis Accords is a U.S.-led, is the next U.S.-led space exploration program that will be in competition with the Chinese and the Russians, which will right now they seem to be operating individually, but they seem to be getting closer and closer. And we'll have to see what they do.
And your recent article book entry is about astronautical ethics, and I'm assuming that speaks a little bit on the rescue agreement and the outer space treaty. How are these two different kind of fronts? I hate to use that word; it sounds like war, but I mean, in a way, how are China and Russia, and then the U.S. Artemis Accords? How's that going to cooperate with the outer space treaty? Is it in violation of the outer space treaty?
Uh, what the Chinese are doing and the Russians so far is not in violation of the Outer Space Treaty. And we can have two tracks. We can have two competing tracks. We had them during the Soviet era when it was just the Soviets and the US. The most important thing to keep in mind is that space exploration, uh, once we are in space, is very dangerous. The human body is very fragile. Traveling through space is very opens us to a lot of threats by asteroids, by radiation, by unforeseen circumstances. So cooperation is the key. Even if we don't get along on Earth, we're going to have to cooperate out there. What I might see serious rivalry would be when we start mining the solar system. And we don't have yet rules set out for claims. Okay, this asteroid mine, that one is yours. I mean, how that's going to work, we don't know yet. For now, we are crawling like babies back to the moon, and then we'll see where we go from there. The danger is, and I mean, it's not that out of the way to use the word front, as you put it. What we have to think is about the outer space front and the national security front, if you want to go that way. Right now, there is so much tension on Earth that there is a lot of talk about weapons in outer space, anti-satellite weapons. That creates another assortment of problems. But it's important to highlight that all of this talk involves the cislunar space, anything between us and the moon. So imagine the vastness of outer space. We could be traveling 1,000 years in one direction and we will not hit the end of our galaxy. so,
Some
uh,
perspective for everyone.
so if we talk about cislunar space, it's just traveling to outer space 3 days out. That is all the space that we are discussing in comparison with everything else. And by the way, when I say 1,000 years, with the technology we have now, at the speed of light, technically we could do it in 80 to 100 years. But that still would be at the edge of the galaxy, not at the edge of the universe. That's goes beyond what we can quantify.
Yeah, I don't think we're gonna catch that. Maybe one day.
We won't be here for that.
Okay, so there's so much going on. Talk to me about cybersecurity, the Viasat thing, how that kind of loops into the current Ukraine Russia war, and I feel like that's unique to Russia because, as you said, they're also building the space station in conjunction with China. How's that landscape look? Why is the Viasat incident important? I guess is that bleeding over into outer space and playing into the tension with the United States and the world scene right now.
The Viasat case is a unique, you could call it a landmark case uh, on what not to do or how to make outer space more dangerous. Uh, Unfortunately, uh, the leadership in Russia at the moment don't seem to care about law in general. They are breaking all the rules, and they uh, behave as if what they were doing was okay, and under the guises of we are protecting our national interests and things of that nature. But going back, uh, so we have to look at cyber first in order to understand how is that affecting space. Uh, so uh, cybersecurity in general is the main concern that we have. What we do in cyberspace. We connecting every time we connect to the internet. This opens up. We open ourselves to dangers. Even if we're looking for convenience or fun or entertainment, that can happen if we don't take appropriate actions, such as updating our browser, keeping track of our antivirus software, things of that nature. At the national level, it gets more complicated because a rival nation may try, or will try, I should say, to interfere with the functioning of the internet for government use. If you cripple a government, you make it vulnerable and you can embarrass them or steal their secrets or even put in danger any assets they might have overseas. So that's one consideration. Uh, what has happened is that Russia every time considers another nation as uh, uh, considered a rival, considered as territory they want to control. They will use cyber attacks to disrupt them as much as possible. And that goes back to the 2007 cyber attack to Estonia. That was also a landmark case because it was the first time that a massive cyber attack by one nation against another. And although we were not able to prove that the Russian government was involved, we could see that attacks originated from their territory and that they were sophisticated enough to believe that the government was involved somehow. Now Russia doesn't seem to care to hide it uh, with the conflict in Ukraine, with their dislikes in Georgia, and with us. They just constantly attack, and we can trace back their attacks to their territory. Uh, so that has been the escalating problem. Take Ukraine. From the moment they took Crimea, the cyber attacks began against the critical infrastructure, in particular the electrical. To go after the electrical grid in another country is very dangerous. You're not just crippling the government or embarrassing the government, but kill the electricity. You can cause car accidents, hospitals not operating properly. Aviation could be affected as well. There are many things connected to the electrical grid. And Russia did it at the moment. So how to deal with that, or what would you do about that? That's a separate subject. The point is that Russia has gotten away with it, and they have escalated it more and more and more until they decided to go after the whole territory of Ukraine. When they started their invasion in 2022, they decided to do all they could to disable the network that the military of Ukraine was using to manage their troops. Now, this network is connected to satellites. And so they found a vulnerability in the network that was connecting to a particular satellite, the KSAT satellite, at the time being managed by an Italian company and in the process of being transferred to Viasat, the American company. Skylogic was transferring the control to Viasat. The Russians, what they did was to interfere at the ground level with the modems that connected the services on the ground with the users, be it computers and other equipment, to the satellite. So the satellite was okay, but they interfere by a cyber attack on the ground. The problem that we have is, and if you look at the policy experts, there is a problem in the center, and they have kind of walked around it, and they have not addressed the main point. And when you try to address it, they get a bit uncomfortable. And it's this: was that attack a space activity? If it is a space activity, then you can say that Russia violated the Outer Space Treaty. However, if we say that, then other activities from other nations could end up crossing the line. So for now, nations have avoided going in that direction because it's better to keep that gray area. Okay, you did it, Russia, but when we do it against you, you're gonna complain. But let's look at it. So outer space wise, we cannot claim 100% there was a violation of space law. Uh, but under space law, was this space activity? So they would say we cannot answer that right now. We don't know. As most, that's what space lawyers are going to say. If you look at the cyber side of the situation, it changes because now we're not talking about semantics, we're not dancing around politics, we just have the science. So, what is the standard to operate a satellite? And you have segments. You have the segment that goes from the satellite to the ground station and backwards. You have the segment that goes maybe between satellites if it's a constellation. And then you have the segment that goes from the satellite to the user. That entire segment is completely on the ground. True. But the entire network is one. Is one element divided in 3 or 4 pieces. If you affect one of those segments, you disable the entire network. So I disable the part of the network that is on the ground, and now I have a satellite orbiting the Earth that is absolutely useless. It's not connecting to anything. So, in my opinion, and this is just my personal opinion, if you have now a disabled satellite because you cannot connect to it in that manner, uh, could we argue that now we have interfered with space activity, that being the connection to it from the ground? And there is no doubt that physically that is happening. So the problem with space is we have seen this type of treatment before. When we talk about the delimitation of between the air and outer space, it's the same thing. Physically, we can prove where air ends and space begins, but under space law, there is no delimitation between the two. Uh, we can utilize the physical attributes of where a plane can no longer fly to say, well, it's obvious that from here forward we had to use a rocket. But we had left it untouched as a gray area to be able to maneuver national interest in some way or another. Right now, because we have those gray areas, Russia has been able, in my opinion, to misuse, let's just say, use a word, misuse outer space to gain ground in the battlefield in Ukraine.
Where do you think? Yeah, like you said, I was thinking the same thing. The demarcation, the Kármán line. Where does air and space? Where does air stop? Where does space begin? Couple questions. How's that dealt with in air law? Because that's at least kind of similar, the same type of thing. And do you think it'll get better over time? Do you think that the distinction will become more defined as we enter space more?
Yes, air is a. We have several agreements that deal with the air, but two main ones. One is the treaty that handles uh, the travel, international travel, and it's called the Montreal Convention, which updated the Warsaw Convention. And without entering too many details, the Warsaw Convention is still applicable in some nations. I would say about half of the nations fall within the Montreal Convention. But in essence, in general, both of those treaties are designed to tell airlines where they can land, what kind of passengers they can pick up, and the liability attached uh, as they travel from nation to nation. Uh, In essence, uh, some flights can go direct to one nation and bounce within that nation. Others are designed to overfly a particular nation and land another, and things like that. Then we had to worry about agreements to handle passengers and what happens to the luggage and things of that nature. But as it relates to space law, uh, once all the laws that handle planes, where they go, where they land, they become uh, null and void, or they become useless once we enter outer space. And the question is always, how do we know when we enter outer space? Well, plane engines do not work in outer space. Eventually, they will freeze and the plane will crash. So we don't want that. So the technology that we need is similar to the Concorde. So we had to go faster and higher. So that's still aviation. But instead of taking 8 hours to land in Madrid from Miami, now it's taking 2.5 hours. The Concorde could land from New York and London in 4. That was a great feat for the 60s and 70s. And it's a shame that we cannot do that right now. Uh, to be fair, the only way that you could enjoy such accommodations were if you could fly business class, because it was only for business. But say you had an emergency, you could cut it in 4 hours. Now we're talking about the new technology of suborbital jets that will be able to do the same thing, but instead of 4 hours, 2.5 or two, depending on I mean, we could fly from New York to LA in an hour, things of that nature. So you could see the convenience of that. However, in order to do that, these jets will have to take off from land and will have to enter outer space in order to make the trip shorter, because the way to make it shorter is by going steep up and then coming steep down to land again. And the only way to do that bell curve is by entering outer space. That means that those jets, at some point in the trajectory, will have to switch planes. I should say, switch engines from jet engines to rockets, enter outer space, and return again with jet engines. The closest thing that we have to that right now is the Virgin Galactic. Virgin Galactic will fly you that way, and when it's about to enter the atmosphere, it switches to rockets. The problem with Virgin Galactic is that in order to make itself more aerodynamic, it separates from the jet engines to enter the atmosphere with rockets, and then it just comes back like the space shuttle, just with the rockets. And that is okay if you're gonna land in the same place where you took off. But if you're gonna land in another place, you're gonna need to have that dual engine capability. And that's what they are working on right now. So going back to your question, since we're gonna be entering on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, from continent to continent and nation to nation, outer space, and then mix it up with air, we're going to have some kind of delineation, because if you are traveling in the air, liability applies in one way, and if you are in outer space, liability goes in a different way. So you are a simple passenger in air, but you are in essence a bit more, not quite an astronaut, but something between passenger and astronaut. Right now, they call it a space tourist. Although you cannot call space tourist somebody just traveling to London. Right now, if I'm just going up to take a peek in outer space to look back at Earth from outer space, yes, that's a tourist. And I might sign a bunch of paperwork that something goes wrong. It's on me. But you cannot just dispense of liability that easy if American Airlines is flying me to London and uses space to cut the trip short.
Do you think it's going to take an accident for us to get some clarification, or are we going to get to a solution before that? I mean,
They
I
are
hope
going
it
to,
doesn't happen, but
yeah. Well, as you know, a lot of lawyers were involved uh, in new standards when all these flights begin, uh, which that will happen within our lifetimes. We're talking about now 20 years on the line. Uh, I mean, I keep track of. There is a company called Supersonic Boom. They are right now working with the FAA and doing all kinds of tests, and everything's going great. But they wanna go commercial, and they have been working. I say 20 years because I have been keeping track of them since 2017, and they are finally starting to pass the tests to get all their permits. Once that happens, then they will have capital to come in and invest with them, and 5, 10 years on the line, they will have the first fleet ready. So at that point, lawyers will have to get together and start looking at aviation law again and space law again. The U.S. is the most, I would say, progressive in that aspect. We look at aviation, we classify suborbital flights. Any flight that enter outer space, we consider it space more than air, while other nations consider more air. So we'll have to get an agreement on how that works. As to your question of accidents, that is where the ethics come into play. The way to put it is this: these are gonna be planes flown by human beings, put together by human beings, and designed by human beings.
it's a
And
common theme.
yes, and vulnerable to malicious human beings. Outer space is a bit of a random guess. Sometimes asteroids get close. Sometimes we have magnetic anomalies. Sometimes we have unexpected solar flares. So accidents, unfortunately, will happen. Will we equip the passengers with special suits that they will borrow when they enter the flight and before they enter at the outer space, they put the helmets on, something like that? You would hope so. Some protection. Uh, Accidents will happen, and as you know, if you get exposed to outer space unprotected, it's a horrible death. There's no, it's worse than drowning, worse than dropping uh, from a plane and crashing with a plane. So uh, we had to prepare for all those things. Rescue operations, how we tell the passengers the danger, what we're going to tell them to prepare if something goes wrong. I think that with all the problems that we're having with Boeings in this day and age, uh, I, people should be more aware of the surroundings and of their own mortality. I mean, we have to live with that.
Yeah, I've always found it fascinating that there's not parachutes on planes or, something. It's just kind of, yeah, well, cost of doing business. I guess that's what happens when you pair capitalism with humans. For the most part, it's good, but there's always that little bit. Was the Concordia outlawed after its accident, or was it just not tried again?
Uh, no, it was an outlaw. At the time, the they were being maintained by British Airways and Air France. The U.S. never had Concords, although NASA experimented with the technology. So it was only those two airline companies. So you could fly to Paris or London in a very short period of time. Uh, at the time, uh, there was discussions about updating the technology, and so both airlines and the airline in general, the engineers of aerospace engineers, were not at the time prepared to deal with an upgrade. Uh, I imagine that some politics were involved as well. The world was a different place by the time Air France and British Airways decided to, you know, this accident was catastrophic. It happened as this is what I'm saying about space, out of space. It happened because a piece of the metal from the prior flight was sitting in the runway, and it got sucked in by one of the jet engines of the Air France flight. Uh, At the time that the engines were built, nobody could anticipate that something like that could happen. They had thought about all kinds of scenarios about how one of these planes could be damaged. None of them thought of this, and so the moment that happened, from at the very moment that the plane tilted to fly up, the engine exploded. So you could say that the explosion began practically with the tires in the back still on the ground. But you know how it is. Once a plane takes off, it can be at 1,000 feet in seconds. And once you look at hydraulic and aerodynamic control, as you say, if you don't have a parachute, that's it. And that's exactly what happened. It came down crashing, I believe, in a residential neighborhood, if I remember correctly. So it killed people on the ground, and all the passengers and crew all died, unfortunately. So they went ahead and retired the fleet.
That's crazy. That ultimately, um, having a big broom could have, but that's just the unforeseen consequences, I guess, that come with this. When you're going really fast with a lot of horsepower, it's going to be more catastrophic. So
Yeah,
there's so much. Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say that wasn't a reason to stop those flights. It was a reason to redesign the engines. As you know, we lost all the astronauts of Apollo 1 because of bad design of the capsule. So they went from that catastrophe, they learned what errors have been made, errors that could not be anticipated before the accident. They learned from that mistake, and Apollo 2 to 17 were perfect. Well, 13 was something else, but regarding the capsule, all were flawless.
Especially thinking about the amount of technology. People say it's less than definitely a phone. I think people have even said like a scientific calculator.
That's
Um,
right. Our iPhones are more power than the computer used in Apollo 11 to land on the moon.
which is just nuts how they did it back then, but we'll always find a way. Unfortunately, we seem to find a way when we're competing with another country, but
That's right. Right now, what is driving the Artemis Accords is the same thing that was driving us back during the Soviet era, competition. But eventually, we're going to have to compete with ourselves. We need resources that we can only find in outer space. And our solar system is full of mining mining treasures waiting for us. And so the next space age is going to be driven mainly by the private sector, by people like Elon Musk that are willing to blow up to 20 rockets out of their own pocket to perfect it and get us. He's the only one right now. I mean, we have a lot of industry around suborbital flights and going to the moon. That is all great. But the real treasures are in the other planets. And he's the only one right now working on that. We have other nations working on probes, and they talk about sending individuals to Mars. Every 5 years, they move the target. I remember in 2003, NASA said, in 5 years, we're sending people to the Mars. I thought it was a great idea, but I already knew they moved that target from the prior 5 years. So now they talk about in 15 years. I say 20. But Elon Musk, if it's going to be 15 years, it's going to be with the private sector.
How does that look from a legal perspective?
Uh, well, that's going to get interesting because the law of Earth is not necessarily enforceable in Mars. But, I mean, it will have to be when the first outpost is built, constructed. It will have to be because we gotta have uh, some kind of law. It won't be as complicated if you think about it because imagine if you took the Stetson campus and moved it to Mars, assuming that you could put a dome over it. Uh, the law of the United States, we don't need it that much. Not even the law of Florida. All we have to do, what are the standards that Stetson utilizes to keep order within campus? So the student handbook, the honor code, those will handle most of the questions that we might have. If there was a death, either intentionally or not, that would require that we revert to some kind of state law. And we could pull out the Florida law books because that's what we have. But let's say that the death occurred due to somebody pushing somebody out of an airlock and killing them without a spacesuit. Well, there's no law, either in federal law or state law for that. So now those individuals there will have to come up with how do we handle these kind of cases. And eventually, the law of Mars will evolve and will be applicable mainly to Mars, mainly to the standards required to survive in that environment. And as the outpost grows with more individuals, more visitors, the population grows, the needs at the local level, the distance. I mean, we're talking about with the technology that we have, and so it takes 6 months to get there one way. But that's only during the times of the year that the Earth is lined up correctly with Mars. So you add that to the equation, now it's going to take longer. So it took you 6 months to get to Mars. You want to return. Well, you might have to calculate the 6 months plus maybe another 3 or 4 before it lines up correctly. So now you just talk a year in Mars before you can come back. Yeah, those are considerations that have to come into play. So you put all of that together, and eventually you end up with something completely different. And now you open up the possibility for political independence and having your own laws and your own set of police mechanisms.
So ultimately, it's going to look more like the Ten Commandments or the Code of Hammurabi versus like the U.S. Code or the United Nations Charter, at least at first, because you just don't need as much.
Yeah, in essence, it will be simplified in a way because now uh, let's say the U.S. set us an outpost. So we have U.S. values, U.S. law, U.S. ideas, but at a much smaller scale. And so right now, federal law handles things that we're not going to need over there. It's going to be a state, you could say an extension of a territory of the U.S. in essence.
They won't be busting up train monopolies or things like that
That's
because
right.
they're going to need it.
Now, if we have the other way that it could go is, as you know, in the moon, we're going to have an international station because of the Artemis Accords. So it will be interesting to see. We don't have yet the framework for that station. What we have right now is a cooperation to get going the gateway, the next international space station, and how that's going to connect to the moon. And yes, we agree that we're going to set up an outpost, but we don't have anything beyond that. So will we? Now we're talking about one unit. So is that unit going to be built in modules like the International Space Station? But then the agreement might look like what we have right now in the International Space Station. If you're in the Russian module, Russian law applies. In the US module, US law apply, etc. Again, that's much easier to enforce at the moon because you're still close. But in Mars, the technology may require a different configuration. And so in the end, if you think about it, just as uh, just as with cyber and with air, the physical attributes of science will dictate how really law will evolve.
What will, obviously, down the line, a Martian independence look like? Will we have a united planets of the Milky Way? Or, I mean, A, that's going to take a long time, obviously. B, would that fall under, I guess, yeah, talk about how it would fall under international law currently, if that needs to be expanded or completely reworked.
The international law that we have at the moment is sufficient to tackle that for one reason. These individuals in Mars, for example, are going to be human beings. So if we're going to extrapolate the same mechanisms that we use at the end of the last age of exploration, when we have the uh, colonial powers and we have the colonies. And the colonies end up getting independence on their own through wars and eventually through recognition via the United Nations. So let's set aside the wars, that's not going to work. So we'll have to use the standards of the UN use to recognize what is a nation. Now it could take 50, 100 years, but I would say that assuming those individuals want to go for that, it would happen during that time period. As long as you have a territory, and we have it, a population, it cannot be just 2 or 3 people. It has to be a population enough to sustain a government, which brings so territory, population, a recognized government, and then the next step is a government that has been functioning in a way that other nations see it as sufficient to manage affairs of that territory. And gaining that political recognition and being able to sustain it technologically is what gives, in the end, the or how the individuals in that territory gain the recognition they require. But for the time that it takes is simply you have to build the population, set up the government, and gain the resources. And you can imagine that in Mars will be a lot. But you have to develop an infrastructure, uh, be able to fund it. So commerce and things of that nature. In a way, kind of like the United States was at the very beginning. We were doing commerce on our own with the Native Americans, with other nations. We might have been a bit. We were in conflict with France first, and then with the UK. But eventually, we started doing commerce with them, then with Spain, and eventually we gained control of our territories. And as I mentioned, how we got there to be recognized as a nation is not applicable in this particular case of Mars. For that, we will look at how Costa Rica gained their independence, uh, how Indonesia got their independence, and how Israel gained independence. They all had to prove these elements that I just mentioned in order to gain recognition.
Do you think the people that inhabit Mars will eventually want that independence?
I wouldn't mind they will, because the people that are going to go to Mars, setting aside the Air Force and Navy guys that we're going to send to explore, those work for NASA. Their intention is to come back. But the people that are going to go there to settle in a colony are going to be like many others that settle throughout the Americas in the first stages of exploration. These were one-way trips. Some of them would get to the other side and dismantle their ships and use the raw material to build their houses and their forts. You know, so they had no intention of coming back. Uh, so those individuals are going to start a new life. I would say their children will not see themselves anymore as humans, more as humans from Mars. And as you know, the longer you are in outer space and gravity and things of that nature, the physiology changes. So one of those children, I don't want to go too much into a tangent, but one of those children will have a hard time going back to Earth. Their eyes will not work right, their bones will be weaker, the gravity will be too heavy for them.
Man, it's crazy to think about that. That's on
Yeah,
the horizon.
if you think about it, and we're talking about Mars, but further down, one of the big targets for NASA is Titan, the the moon of Saturn, or one of the moons, but it's a habitable moon, has water. Uh, and Titan is it might be a moon, but it's quite a large celestial body. It's way bigger than our moon, and that's another place where you most likely see an outpost.
And you mentioned ships and kind of the parallel of people immigrating to new worlds in the past. And a lot of your writings have talked about the moral and ethical considerations applied to space travel. I watched the movie Passengers to kind of get my mind going last night, and Chris Pratt woke up Jennifer Lawrence, and she said like, "Hey, you murdered me. You took away my life. Pretty much, they woke up 90 years early, and there's no way to go back to sleep. They were in hibernation chambers." So she was saying it was essentially murder. How are we going to deal with problems like that? Do we look back to shipwrecks and things of that nature, or is it something completely different?
Oh, this is absolutely you're absolutely correct. So we're gonna have whether you plan to return or not. You're going to Mars one way is one way. You're a scientist that want to come back to Earth. It's still the same ethical dilemma. What do you do when there is an accident in transit and you don't have resources to return or to bring everybody back? How do you handle that? If you remember in the movie Contact, when she was getting ready to enter the pod to travel through that interdimensional machine they have built. They gave her a pill to, in essence, to kill herself if something went wrong. Something that Carl Sagan insisted that NASA does, but doesn't tell the public. I don't know. As you know, and again, all we have is NASA to know and Roscosmos. So, just to give you an example, Roscosmos was testing the vacuum environment in training the astronauts. So it was a large hangar, and they will pump all the air out, and in essence became outer space in there. And one of the technicians who was working locked the door and activated a mechanism. He was still inside, and so this guy experienced the vacuum of space for a minute and a half.
Ugh.
Now, as you can imagine, you start bleeding through the ears, bleeding through the eyeballs. It's not a pretty thing. He survived in part because he passed out after 25 seconds, and he was rescued with this 1.5 minutes. That's the maximum that you can be recovered without permanent damage. Once you go beyond that, your body goes through too much damage to be able to anybody to revive you. After 2 minutes, forget it. You start deforming. It's not pretty. So if you know that you're gonna and think about it from this angle. If you put the hand in top of the stove and it burns, it's gonna be painful for 2 seconds. So just imagine going through that for half a minute or a full minute. If for some reason you have the bad luck of not passing out immediately. But you have time to avoid that, and you're gonna die anyway. Shouldn't we give the astronauts the opportunity to avoid the misery and to die with dignity? I mean, that's a question that we need to ask. Are we gonna give that same opportunity to the passengers? That's one question. I mean, in the case that you want to handle it yourself, it might be that you're gonna die, and we have seen fights in planes. People under extreme stress and difficult circumstances, they have been husbands that have elbowed their wives trying to get to a rescue boat. Imagine that. You want to live so badly that you have elbowed your wives, forget it, let her drown, I want to live. Of course, the Coast Guard doesn't think that very kindly when people do that. But we have to anticipate all kinds of weird behavior. And again, people are desperate, tired, sweaty, with low oxygen, and they're going to behave in a consistent manner. So we might have to have somebody on board, like the captain, to make decisions for them. We want to, as you know, the captain might have its own supply of oxygen separate from the rest of the ship. He's a law at that time, and he might have to make decisions that are for the greater good. Right now, all we have is aviation to resort to and some standards from human rights law to try to predict where that's going to go as we move into outer space and we take more people there.
There's definitely a lot there, and we're only scratching the surface of what it's going to look like over the next 100, 200 years. Can we talk about Manfred Locke's great international court justice, big space law guy? He said that, I'm paraphrasing here, technology is always going to outpace the law. Do you think that's true? Do you think we can get ahead of it in this case?
Right now, that's exactly what is happening. And that was a clear statement and a warning that unfortunately is not being followed. Because unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you look at it, space, space law, and cyberspace and cyber law don't observe borders. These are environments that react to technology at the global scale and beyond. Uh, Governments try to control it at the national level, but they were not designed to operate at the national level. And every time one nation does one thing, another does the other, and there's a conflict between the two. The technology is evolving regardless of what the nations want to do, but because they are not cooperating, no new law is not created. So you look at the writings of, uh, for example, Russian lawyers, they they will have a lot of discussions about how to behave peacefully between nations in the use of cyberspace, and they give you this great analysis on what works. But yet, their nation is the number one violator of those same standards. So what they say is not what they do, and because of that, we cannot catch up to the technology. And now add to that artificial intelligence, which impacts both of them, and we have a bigger problem.
Coming back to Earth for one final question. You've spoken at the United Nations, and we see the United Nations playing a big role today. Do you think the United
The
Nations is the answer to keeping us out of World War III? And do you think that will be the mechanism 100 years in the future?
uh, if you had asked me that question 20 years ago, I would have said absolutely the UN was the way to go. Uh, it was a bit more optimistic time, but after the war in Ukraine, I don't I don't have as much faith in the UN as I did because the Security Council, being one of the main bodies that brings order to the world, or supposed to, is ineffective. In part because we, I mean, the veto powers is problematic because you have only a small number of countries in the world that can veto something, like the U.S., Russia, France. But what makes so Russia doesn't like something, they can veto it. China doesn't like it, they can veto it. The U.S. they don't veto it. So we have blocks, the uh, political blocks and military alliance blocks within the UN. So the UN is supposed to be one world, but in reality, outside of the UN, it's not one world. We got these factions, and so we are operating in a fractured political environment. And so I don't see the UN. Uh, Obviously, the Outer Space Treaty came out of the UN, but ask any space law expert, we cannot expect any effort like that happening anytime soon. So, what is going to drive law in many ways is the technology itself, the standards that come behind. And that's why in cyber, the standards engineers put out for all the other stakeholders to use and apply to make the technology work and to protect consumers uh, will work, and it's working much faster than, say, a UN mechanism. A lot of the nations, when it comes to the outer space, look at the US for guidance because for the longest time, the US has been the creator of space law at the national level. The entire Title 51 of the US Code is space. So the nations grab Title 51, put it under the arm, go back and read it and adopt it, although in one way or another, they change the headings or whatever, but you end up seeing very similarities adopted in other nations like that. So the national, for now, the national governments, more than any international body, is gonna drive space law. We will not abandon the original standards, but the original standards will be refined at the national level.
And do you think there's obviously a lot going on in the world today? Do you think the tensions here are too strong to back down from something like a World War III, or do you think it's manageable and maybe a little hyped up by the media?
Uh, to that, I would say that we have enough rising tensions at the moment to possibly end up in a war. Having said that, if that happens, everybody will lose. If nuclear weapons are used, it's going to be a mess. If we engage in war in outer space, it's going to be a mess because we're going to create the collateral damage is going to be substantial debris that could trap us. I mean, with so much garbage around the atmosphere that we can end up trapped in the planet. So right now, we are still working with the Russians in outer space, and we don't interfere with the China is doing or with any other nation for that matter. For now, I am hoping that the way we operate and we're kind of there's all these rising stations will be like a bad cold, you know, that works through the sociological and geopolitical system of the earth and move out, and that could take another decade. But eventually, we start cooperating. As you know, in about I cannot remember right now, if it's 25 or 50 years, but anyway, with the next few decades, there is an asteroid that is pretty close to collision course with Earth. So we have to be prepared for that. We will need weapons, maybe. Right now, as you know, NASA has been testing, and they don't tell you what they are doing these things. So we had a satellite that we sent into an asteroid close to Jupiter, and we crashed it with the purpose to see if we could move it, the asteroid, and we did. We have been studying ways to move satellites, alter trajectories, and things of that nature. It's in preparation for things like that. So planetary dangers will continue to be there and could be damaging for everybody if we don't work together to be vigilant. Right now, the U.S. doesn't have access to the entire space. We can see only where our lenses are pointing to. We have many, but we rely with the guys in Australia. We rely with the guys in China and Russia. They're going to see things that we cannot see. And if we don't work together and an asteroid hits anywhere in the world, it wipes us out. So I'm hoping that will take governments into the higher level into survival and cut all these global conflicts that we have at the moment.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah, exactly. We have some malicious actors, no doubt, but I think that most peoples of the world, regardless of their political affiliation, can work together and most. I mean, everybody has pretty much the same goals: make things better for themselves. I think that's every country I visited. That's the number one objective: and for every nation. We don't have to. I mean, when I work with lawyers from China and Russia, politics don't come into the picture. Perhaps we joke here and there, but nothing. It doesn't get personal. It's always how we can, as humanity, accomplish a goal and get other nations to share on the peaceful exploration of outer space.
Maybe it'll just take us being confronted by our mortality as a species to come together and stop aiming the weapons at each other.
Hopefully, not at the last minute.
Yeah, that'd be ideal. I'd like to. I don't want that to be the last thing I see. Although it probably would be a pretty good sight to see. Dr. Balleste, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. I think you have more degrees than anyone else I know, so I
Thank
appreciate
you.
and respect your time here today. It's
It's
great talking about the future.
an honor and a pleasure. Thank you very much.